This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network. A huge thanks goes out to Jacob Herr. Links to learn more about Jacob and his history-themed merchandise website can be found at trendinghistory.com or in the show notes. In this episode, we talk about the 1999 film One Man's Hero, based on the history of the San Patricio Battalion in the Mexican-American War. In the last episode, Jacob led us through the real history, background, and context of this fascinating story. Listening to that episode only makes this one even better. You can now support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon and Subscribestar. By joining on Patreon or Subscribestar, you're effectively becoming a part of the team of keeping this whole operation going, and you get many great benefits. Go over to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen or subscribestar.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more. Another really great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These ratings and reviews really help me know what you think of the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. More about the Parthenon Podcast Network can be found at parthenonpodcast.com. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies and stories so great they should be movies on various social media platforms by searching for A2Z History. Links to all of this and more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. I thank you for joining me again, Beyond the Big Screen. I'd like to welcome back Jacob Herr to Beyond the Big Screen. Jacob has been on to talk about Billy the Kid in film and in history. And in the last episode, so I highly suggest you go back and listen to the last episode, he gave us a ton of background and context on the San Patricio Battalion from the Mexican-American War. Today, we are going to talk about the 1999 film, One Man's Hero, a film that dramatizes the events of the San Patricio Battalion during the Mexican-American War. And like I said, I highly encourage people to go back and listen to our episode on the history of the San Patricios and Catholic deserters from the U.S. Army to the Mexican Army during the Mexican-American War. I really think you'll enjoy it. But just to set things up for today, in this 1999 film starring Tom Berenger, what's the very short story of the San Patricios?
So the very short nutshell version of the San Patricios, they were a group of immigrants, most of them associated with Catholicism, but others just trying to seek new life in America and winding up in the military at the outbreak of the Mexican-American War. And through the circumstances of the conflict, many of these immigrants had ended up deserting the U.S. Army, making their way to Mexico, and then offering their services to the Mexican military because they found a stronger connection culturally to the Mexican people than to the United States.
Now, this film, it stars, as we said, Tom Berenger as Sergeant, Lieutenant, Captain John Riley. Berenger, he almost made a career out of playing the grizzled army sergeant, and this time he does it with an Irish accent. Yeah. We have Joaquim de Alameda. He plays Cortina, and I found him as kind of the shining star of the movie. For me, even though his part's kind of almost inexplicable, but I think that as an actor, he did a wonderful job. And De Alameda is actually a Portuguese actor, and a shout out to a great friend of the show and a personal friend, Antonio from Portugal, who pointed this out to me. And then the other main star, I guess, of the movie, you could say, is Daniela Romero, who plays Marta, the love interest in this really strange love triangle between Cortina, Tom Berenger's Riley character, and then Marta. And she's a famous Mexican musician of the 80s and 90s. I guess it's really hard to find a place to start with this movie. I guess for me, it happens it's one of my first questions of the movie is really up front in the movie. Sergeant Riley, he turns on a dime and he deserts from the army. He's pretty cool with the army. He's putting this as a U.S. sergeant, he's putting people in their place. He has like one kind of sort of negative interaction with his commander. And then like boom, bang, bang, he's deserted the U.S. Army. He's fighting for the Mexican army. I have to imagine in history, and we talked about in the last episode, it didn't happen that quickly. But why do you think in the movie they did it that quickly?
Two reasons. One, bad writing. And secondly, when you're trying to take history that encourses multiple years and multiple different political and social environments, and you have to put them together into this 2-hour movie that you're going to show to the public and try to make money off of it, there's a lot to cram in. And I think that's one of the big problems when you have this dramatic shift in plot less than 10 minutes into the movie. It comes off as very awkward and very poorly written. And here's an anomaly that I found out about the writing of the movie. Apparently, the guy who had written the script, his name was Milton S. Gelman. He had actually had a history of writing for television, and exclusively 50s Western television that we had talked about in our Sam Peckinpah, Pat Garrett, and Billy the Kid episode. He wrote episodes for Tombstone Territory, Gunsmoke, that entire subgenre of television in the 50s and 60s. Now, here's the kicker. He actually passed away in 1990. So he never actually got to see this script that he created turn into the final product. And so it must have just been bouncing around from one studio to another before it was picked up by the director and the producer, Lance Houle.
That makes a lot of sense because it has such a taste and a feel of a Western, but not in a good way either. I'd love to get your thoughts on this because you're an actor and have done stage and probably have a good ton more experience and education in this, but it seemed the whole theme of the movie is a tight shot. Everything is zoomed in on these like small moments and you miss the whole big picture, like all the action, it's zoomed in and we'll get into it. But in the Battle of Churubusco, you get no sense of the battle. It just looks like there's like 10 guys on each side going at it. And that just seemed the whole movie to me it's too zoomed in and you get no idea of the big picture.
Yeah. And now, granted, I have seen some movies where that is actually used to your advantage, where you have a very small amount of extras or main characters, and you're trying to encompass a historical battle that had thousands or tens of thousands of people, shooting at each other and hacking each other to death. But when you're trying to capture it on film, one of the ways that you can try to make things look larger than what you really have to work with is that you use the camera almost as if the cameraman is like another person in that battle. Sergei Eisenstein did it in Alexander Nevsky, and even I know another famous director had done it in an independent project. Orson Welles did it in Chimes at Midnight, 1965. The difference, though, is that when you're using cinematography like that, you're trying to get a first-person perspective where everything has to be clear. You need to have an established sense of what is at stake and a connection to the characters. We're not connected to these characters because they're so poorly written. They're not characters. They're caricatures. And because everything is so hectic, we have no idea what's happening.
I thought I felt like De Alameda, Cortina almost telegraph that he made a line while Berenger is Sergeant Riley. He's injured and Marta's rehabilitating him. She's nursing him back to health. And Cortina says, "Oh, you're going to fall in love with your nurse." And it was almost, I could imagine him ad-libbing that because it was so bad. It was so obvious that Berenger was going to fall in love, and it happened.
Oh, that's not how love works. In real life, that's not how love works. In real life, true love is finding out what temperature to put the thermostat on, not cuddling up in front of a deserted Mexican town. Which I will give the movie credit on one thing. They actually did do a lot of location filming, not necessarily in like the specific places, but very adjacent areas. Maybe it's just because the filming in Mexico is a little more economical, but it does fit the subject of the movie.
Yeah, I thought a lot of the scenery, I think definitely, at least it felt legit. It wasn't screaming. It wasn't in the Pacific Northwest or something, or in Canada where they film a lot of B-grade movies. At least they had some feeling of being in Mexico and then the Southwest. But again, with the love triangle, it seemed so tortured, and they just dragged it out until the very last scene of the movie for no reason. Cortina and Riley are fighting it out after the climax of the movie. The climax of the movie was the love triangle.
Yes, and it felt completely unnecessary. You could still tell the story of the San Patricios without this love triangle, which leads me to either believe that was not in the original script that Gelman had written, or maybe it was, or it was placed in there because they were trying to cash in on this dying franchise of historical love triangles and historical romance dramas that were part of that 90s and early 2000s subgenre of cinema and television at that time.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, the movie would have lost nothing to have just completely cut out the romance element, 100%. I mean, in fact, the movie would have been much better because they could have spent more of the 2 hours on the actual conflict of the movie, trying to understand why people would desert from the country that they made an allegiance to join the other country. That would have made sense. But instead, they just keep torturing that love triangle romance angle.
And trying to shove a political narrative that doesn't exist.
Yeah, I would like to hear your thoughts on that, because it wasn't something... I kind of got tastes of that. I think it was they had a lot of dialogue throughout the movie of what soldiers would have probably have never had. There was a lot of melodramatic, just basically speechifying dialogue that these characters would have.
Yeah, I think that's another thing just that goes back to the bad writing, but also feeling as though like there's this element of like Christian persecution that they're trying to put into this movie. And I did do some deeper research. None of the studios involved were like independent religious media. I tried looking into Lance Hool himself. I couldn't find out if he was like religiously motivated to make this movie. But it seems as though this movie has kind of established the structure that a lot of these religious-based movies that you see today, they try to establish political narratives that are either irrelevant, fringe, or they straight up don't exist in modern times. And by trying to say, oh, it happened, by the fact that it happened then, it could easily happen today in our secular nation. It's ridiculous. It's objectively ridiculous. It would make a law student or a history major like me at the time when I first discovered this movie probably change majors.
Yeah, I think so much of it just came from really bad writing. They have all these characters that they never develop. And so you don't really understand what their motivation is. And I could see that when they do their monologues with Destiny, to borrow a phrase from a fellow podcaster, Scott Rank, and he uses that one. In that way, the way Scott uses it, the monologue with Destiny, is what John Wayne did in the 60s and in the 50s. And that's what you get the taste of with this movie. In no way if you showed this, I think, to anybody who's never seen it, I think they would say that this was probably an early 80s movie.
Yeah, and that just blows my mind. It has the age of a movie that was made in 1999. Granted, the production had actually started in 1997. So for the course of that 2 years, $11.3 million was put into this movie. Where that money came from, I have absolutely no clue. But then to wind up with a box office revenue of only $230,000.
Yeah, I can't imagine with that kind of money. That's big money. That's big screen money. And this was not a big screen movie at all. This was the Saturday afternoon matinee on the History Channel movie.
Hit that right over the head.
So I think maybe lay out a couple more of your problems and we'll try to sift through it and see if we can find some good in this.
Okay, so over the course of watching the movie, poor character development because 90% of the writing is put into this rushed, politically religiously motivated narrative of persecution in early modern America. And couple that with poor cinematography in the battle scenes, which they only show 2 battles and the aftermath of a third. They show the Battle of Monterrey, which was not their first battle, but it's still a historically important one in terms of the history of the conflict. The aftermath of the Battle of Buena Vista, and then the Battle of Churubusco. They try to rush it with narration that is either put on screen, because if you're trying to show a historical movie, your audience has to read everything because apparently you have to hold their hand the whole time, or it's narrated, and even the narration that they provide is historically inaccurate.
Yeah, I think that is the worst in a historical movie, where it's text walls because they haven't done anything to give you any context of what's happening, or they have to give you a really heavy-handed, detailed narration because, again, they haven't developed anything through the characters and through the story.
Exactly. That would be like if you're doing Shakespeare and instead of actually having a narrator that actually performs and gives an opening monologue to set the scene, that would just be like if you took the text and you just put it on a projection. It's not the same effect.
Yeah, and so many of these scenes where they're just walking, they're grumbling, there were so many opportunities for them to really develop the exposition between the dialogue between these characters, and they never do it.
Yeah, and you can see that in some of those characters where you get bits and pieces of these caricatures of these different supporting cast. You have one of the deserters was from one of the German states, and it implies that he fought against Napoleon. There's another guy from Ireland. There's another guy from this place and that place. And there's all this potential to create a very well socially and culturally diversified cast of supporting characters, but they never take advantage of it. And so it just leaves that potential of what if. I understand that it has to be a 2-hour movie and you have to constrain things, but when your basic storytelling skills fall flat on its face time and time again, I'm just going to change the channel.
Yeah, I thought with the whole De Cortina story arc too, how much did the De Cortina was a historical character, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. How much did his story interface and intersect with the San Patricio's and the deserters?
A little bit, but I think this is just one of those plot devices where they try to tie in historical characters just to make things more interesting. Compare that to a more recently made Western called The Harder They Fall, where they tried to incorporate all these different African-American figures of the American West, Bass Reeves and Jim Beckworth and all these other different characters together in this one fictional storyline. It's a very unique concept. Historically, these people never knew each other because of the span of history. Like by the time Bass Reeves was working as a U.S. Marshal in Oklahoma, Jim Beckworth was already long dead, and he would have been living while he was alive with the Crow Indian Nation. He was adopted into the tribe. So merely by that distance alone, yada, yada, yada. But it does make good fiction, and that's the intent of the movie. It's fictional. Here, this is supposed to be real history, and they're just trying to make it something that it isn't. I'll give it credit that the real Cortina was actually a real figure, and the possibility of him knowing who the San Patricios were by word of mouth is, it's a crapshoot. But at the same time, there is a line that implies that he was once an officer in the Mexican army and that he had fought at the Battle of San Jacinto in the Mexican Revolution. That's complete BS. That never happened.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, in a lot of ways, I think that they probably were trying to use that Cortina character to at least show that the Mexican army and Mexico as a country was in some way involved in this. Because, I mean, honestly, if you didn't have him, you wouldn't even know that this was a part of the Mexican-American War. No. Because it's so flat and it falls so flat with all of the, I would have loved to have seen, and we'll get into ways to make it better, but Zachary Taylor's in it so little. And, Hancock is in it so little. Not Winfield Scott Hancock.
No, you're thinking of Winfield Scott Hancock was a Civil War officer.
Yeah, Winfield.
So we're talking exclusively Winfield Scott.
Winfield Scott is in it so little, and then there's that other character, that Major, who's sort of the advocate for Riley, who pops up now and again. I think he's a major. He has a big mustache.
I think it was a colonel, but his name was Colonel Benton Lacey. I remember that from the movie, yeah. And I actually did some research. He was not actually a real officer in the U.S. Army during the Mexican-American War. So, I mean, it could have been a little more accurate if they could actually give the character the name of the real colonel of the 5th Infantry Regiment, but they just decided to come up with a fake name.
And that's just it's so unnecessary. And I wonder what you felt with this. I kind of felt like they maybe had some of these characters written expecting that they'd get a bigger name actor in them, and maybe having a fairly big name actor doing these little bit parts as a cameo, but then they wind up getting nobodies. I think that Winfield Scott's character actor was somewhat a name, but not anything that'd be like, whoa, that's otherwise the Tom Berenger is really the only recognizable name. I think most people would recognize De Alameda from, he was in a great movie, I think it was called Bandidos.
It sounds familiar because I did take a Latin American cinema class as part of my history major, and how the history of Latin America was depicted in film. So I do remember his name and I do remember his face. But what you were saying before,
with Antonio Banderas, he was in a movie that was great, and I want to say it was Bandidos, but I'm not exactly. I'm not 100% sure that. But it's still, I mean, he was the shining star of the movie.
He really was the shining star of the movie. You could tell that the guy was kind of in a project that he didn't really like, but he was willing to do it, either for the sake of trying to redeem the project or just because he needed a paycheck. Which also brings up the fact that whoever they cast to play Zachary Taylor, He doesn't look like Zachary Taylor. He looks like Sam Elliott, but he's not Sam Elliott. And which that would make a very unique casting, because Sam Elliott did play General John Buford in Gettysburg. And so I could easily see a mustacheless Sam Elliott playing Zachary Taylor. But they just didn't bother. They just went with a nobody. And the same thing with Winfield Scott. And they turned his character into an almost cartoonishly evil man. I'll bet, I will say that the real Winfield Scott was not, he wasn't the nicest guy to be around. They literally gave him the nickname Old Fuss and Feathers. But at the same time, you could have used a unique casting for that, and they just didn't bother either fleshing out his character or getting a name worthy of recognition to make that part amazing and memorable.
You kind of wonder where the $11 million went to. When you look at Tom Berenger, he's kind of peak his career. He's definitely not. He was a name at that point, but I think if you had Tom Berenger as the star with $11 million, you could get a couple more Tom Berenger level actors in here. And really, you don't have any names of any sort in this movie, which is really shocking.
Yeah, I can easily see somebody like Val Kilmer, or somebody, once again, going back to Sam Elliott, or even, Brendan Fraser. He had already done the Mummy movies at that time, which were like pseudo Indiana Jones. But I can see him like playing Colonel Lacey or something like that. There was real potential here. And, where that $11.3 million came from and how it was used is a total mystery to me.
In a lot of ways, you could even say if they did film some of it in Mexico, they could have done that on a sandlot in Los Angeles, and you probably wouldn't have ever noticed the difference. Some of the towns, that last town where they have a battle scene of a raid of, I believe it was some Mexican revolutionaries, they raid a village, and then that's where De Alameda Cortina fights off a couple of guys for some reason. That could have been done in LA very easily, and you didn't get a real sense of that this is a real town in Mexico. It looked like a soundstage.
Yes, it did look like a soundstage. It looked like something from old Tucson Studios in Arizona.
So I guess this is a good point to get into some of the areas that we've talked a little bit about, the many, many, many problems, some of the things that they did well. What do you think could have made this movie better?
I think one thing that could have made this movie better, don't make it a movie, because with a story that is this dramatic and this complicated, it would have worked much better as a miniseries. And granted, there were a lot of miniseries to work with that had budgets of equal size. We had North and South with Patrick Swayze. We had The Blue and the Gray, which was a little bit before then. And so because this is a Mexican-American war, and there was even an episode of North and South that took place in that conflict that built up to the secessionist movement and the beginning of the Civil War. So that would have fit that area and that market, that niche market, very well. But they just didn't go down that avenue. And by turning it into a miniseries, you could have had the time and the opportunity to showcase different kinds of battles, to showcase different political factions, not just within the U.S. Army and the San Patricios, but also the renegade group that Cortina had led against the Mexican government, and even perspectives of the Mexican government themselves, because to them, this was an invasion. Their political and their survival is at stake. You could create real dramatic tension, like something out of Game of Thrones, and they just didn't bother.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I think a three-parter, classic 90s, 80s, 90s, early 2000 miniseries, not a Netflix series, because that would have been something else. I think it put it in its time and its place, a miniseries of 3 2-hour episodes. I think they could have done what they were trying to do in that amount of time. They just didn't have the time, or really maybe the creativity to do the what they were trying to do in a 2-hour feature length movie.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, the whole idea of maybe perhaps because the Catholicism narrative, it is there. It is part of the history of the San Patricios, but don't make it the primary narrative and don't turn it into something that it isn't. Trying to say that, oh, the persecution happened back then and it's easy, and our society is so secular as that it could easily happen today, and that, Catholics and Christians are now vulnerable in today's time. Like, no, don't go down that avenue. You can make it, you can make it like, you can make subtle hints at it, because that is a part of the real history, but it should not be the primary motivation of these characters.
I would have liked, along those lines too, I would have liked to have seen the whole, in a 2-hour movie. I think they could have cut out the Cortina aspect, because then and I wonder what you think of this. They would have taken out that narrative arc that they would have had to have dealt with, and then put in, and probably they could have cast De Alameda in this role, a Mexican officer that O'Reilly has to interface with. And that could have been an interesting conflict.
Yeah, and they did have one of those characters, that Colonel Nexer, who later ends up Brigadier General when he faces off against Scott about the death sentences of the San Patricios. There was real opportunity to flesh out that character, but because he's the only character that represents the Mexican government and the Mexican military, there's just potential that was just never sought after. There was no drive to fleshing out that character. And I think Alameda would have made that would have been a better casting. It really would have.
That whole scene with where Nexar and Scott are going back and forth, and I think there was so much opportunity there. And it's just basically Scott is, meh, nobody cares, or I don't care. And then next thing you know, they brand Riley with the D for deserter, and that's it. There's no development there. That was the conflict of this whole war, is that it was illegal. It was over the top. There was no reason to do what they did. But you still have an American general sitting in Mexico City. They could have developed that, and they didn't. And I don't know if it was a lack of creativity or a lack of skill. These themes they just, to me, seem like such low hanging fruit for discussion amongst characters. They just don't do anything with it.
Exactly. And the entire part in the end where they literally drag Riley on the ground and have him watch all of his comrades get hung, that never even happened in real life. They just tossed him back into his cell because he was among the deserters that left before the war broke out. So my guess is that scene was either included in the original script or later on during production to over-dramatize the narrative once again.
Another thing that might have been interesting too is, and I think it could have furthered the story and furthered people's understanding, is maybe have a scene with Polk where they just lay out the exposition that this was because it kind of leaves you hanging of, okay, they've taken the capital of Mexico City, but then they don't really do anything with it. Why did they take the capital of Mexico City? One scene of Polk having a conversation with another cabinet member could have laid out that whole exposition, or even a scene between Zachary Taylor arguing with each other could have laid out that exposition, and they just never did it.
And that would have been extremely effective, because we know historically that Taylor and Winfield Scott, granted they were both in the same echelon of the military, and they had grown up and in the same environments, they despised one another. They hated each other's guts. Taylor hated Scott for taking the ultimate control of military maneuvers in Mexico, and Scott basically hated Taylor because even though they were both Virginians, they were not necessarily cut from the same cloth. So there could have been something there about how Taylor started from the bottom and worked his way up alongside the common soldier and the junior officer. And Scott started off already on the high horse.
So many I think that in the end, that's what we get to, is there's so many interesting things that they could have pursued and they did none of it.
Yeah. It just leaves you with your hand over your forehead, just saying, if only they took all this money, $11.3 million. I've said that number before and I'll say it again. Thinking of the potential that they could do with just a little bit of creativity. I'll give it some credit that this was an independent studio and it was distributed by Orion, because apparently MGM the original distributors, they had walked away from the project. What reasons, we don't know. But because Orion was also more than willing to distribute literally anything that they were willing to get their hands on, some projects really good and others just complete garbage that nobody remembers, and for good reason, it just leaves you wondering the potential of what this could have been instead of this dragged out, slow burn of a movie that leaves you disappointed.
Yeah, some of the Orion films were pretty decent too. Mississippi Burning came out of Orion, but I think by '99 it had fairly been a spent force, and that was their last production. It just was such a shame that this movie could have been one of a great Western / historical war movies. That Western element could have been tied into it, but they just fail. I think that's the thing that I keep coming back to, is it's such a fail. And my question to you is to make your appeal to the listener out there. Do you think that this is something worth watching? Is it so bad it's good? What do you think about that?
That actually really is a difficult question, Steve, because how I feel about it, there's one school of thought that tells me this movie is complete garbage, and I would not show this movie to an inmate who committed a lifelong string of murders and has no remorse. But at the same time, there is some value, because this is not absolutely horrible. I have seen worse than this. There are bits and pieces that we can harness from it. It's like dissecting a frog in high school biology class. You take certain parts of it and you get an understanding of how this actually works. But then when you put all these parts together, all mangled, and they don't work very well, and then turn it out into this one product, it's just, no, you need to go back to the drawing board, please. It took you 2 years. You can do better. And you just fell flat on your face again.